Hey, well, good morning again. If we haven't met, I'm Eric. I get to serve as one of the pastors here. I live in Saratoga Springs, Utah, up north, so I get to spend most of my time serving our campuses up there. But man, I love being here. And I just want to pick up where Matt left off and just celebrate. Like he said, we exist to help as many people as possible follow Jesus with devotion and delight. And on Easter Sunday, we helped and served and reached more people than ever before in our 25-year history as a church. And so I think we should just celebrate that. Yeah. And so for those of you who volunteer and serve and give and have been here for many, many years, thank you for what you do. And for those of you who are just checking this out, there's a story being written here. And I want you to know you can be a part of it. More than that, God wants you to know you can be a part of it. And so wherever you are at in that journey, whatever next step you're taking, I'm really glad that you're here today. Now, truth is an interesting thing. Truth is an interesting thing. When we have truth, and my definition of truth is the way things actually are, that which actually is. When we have truth and we believe we have truth, it leads to certainty in our lives. It leads to strength in our lives. It brings confidence into our lives. Truth is the type of thing we build our lives on. It's the bedrock, it's the foundation of who we are. And so we build our lives on it, we build our families on it, we build our relationships on it, we build whole communities on this idea of truth. But every so often there's an uncomfortable experience that we can go through. You've been through it, or perhaps you know somebody who's been through it. There are moments when we discover that what we believed was true actually isn't true at all. This is one of the most uncomfortable and disorienting things we can experience as humans. And so I want to start with a question today. It's in your bulletin. I want to put it up on the screen. The question I have for us is this question: what do you do? What do you do when you discover that the truth you built your entire life on is a lie? What do you do when that happens? When you discover that you are 100% in on something only to find out you are 100% wrong about that thing. You were all in, but unfortunately you just discovered through some type of information or experience or situation that you were all wrong about that something. What do you do in that moment? It's uncomfortable. It's tense. It's sad. There's a lot that happens in moments like that, and walking away from that, walking away from those previously held beliefs, it's not just choosing a new belief system, a new doctrinal system, a new worldview. Walking away means walking away from everything that you loved. It can mean walking away from a culture, walking away from friends, walking away from family. It can mean walking away from relationship. What do you do in the aftermath of discovering that you were all in, but now you were all wrong? You know what I call that moment? A spiritual emergency. How do you survive a spiritual emergency like that? Today, we start a new series, and the series is called Triage: How to Survive a Spiritual Emergency. Triage is the process of determining the right course of action based on someone's injuries. If there's medical professionals in the room, you understand triage way better than I do, but I looked it up for today. I looked it up as I've been studying it for this series. It's the process of assigning care or treatment for someone in the midst of their injury, in the midst of their emergency. And so I want to talk about this. Last week, we wrapped up a series studying in the Gospel of Matthew. We were looking at what the kingdom was like, the kingdom is like. So we studied in Matthew. In 5 weeks, we're going to start a brand new series through the New Testament letter of Colossians. We're going to study through it chapter by chapter. I hope you'll be back for that study. It's going to be exciting. But for 5 weeks, I felt like I wanted to help us all navigate spiritual emergencies. I've lived in Utah 8 years now, and I've seen a lot of people go through a spiritual emergency. Call it a faith crisis, call it deconstruction, call it what you will, but these are very painful moments for people. And while there are similar themes and similar trends in all of these stories, no story is identical to the next. And so for some of us, this series is really timely, because perhaps you're in the middle of a spiritual emergency right now. Or maybe you are in the aftermath of kind of your previous worldview crashing down. Or maybe you just know people, someone in your neighborhood, someone at work, a cousin, an in-law. Maybe you know somebody who's gone through a spiritual emergency or is in one now, and you want to help, but you're not sure where to begin. You're not sure how to support. This series is designed to help people in it. It's designed to help people who want to help people in it, in a spiritual emergency. So for 5 weeks, we're going to track through that we might have a triage process, where to start and where to move forward so that someone can come out the other side of a spiritual emergency, not having just survived, but actually being people who can then thrive again. And the good news is this: there are people all across this room, across all of our campuses, who have gone through some of the most painful spiritual emergencies you could imagine. They are thriving now. They have joy now because of Jesus. They love church. They love being a part of community. But that's not an easy process. So I want to take you through it. Tom and I are going to take you through it over the next 5 weeks. I'm very excited about that. But to start, I want to begin with a very real physical emergency that happened in the Nelson household, okay? A few years ago, my daughter Nora and I, we were mountain biking. I want to introduce you to Nora. She's 10. She couldn't be here this weekend. Sometimes she comes down. I just love seeing that picture of Nora. Nora's 10, and a few years ago we were mountain biking, and I'm the type of guy that thinks people are better at things than they are, you know? My wife and I fight about this all the time. I'm like, you can do it. She's like, no, I can't. I'm like, yes, you can. And she actually probably needs some more help, you know, and it creates a lot of tension in the marriage. But I took Nora on this trail, and I'm like, Nora, I think you can handle it. She's like, all right, Dad. And so we start mountain biking down this trail, and she picks up a ton of speed. And I'm her mechanic. I don't know if her brakes were working properly, but she's flying down this hill. She begins to lose control, and I'm like, Nora, you know, and it's like a dad moment where I was worried, my heart is racing. Maybe you've had a moment like this. She goes over the bars, head first in one of those oak bushes that exist in Utah, you know, not a big tree, but a small tree. And I'm like, you know what? She had a helmet on. I'm sure she's fine, you know. So I pull up. She's not fine, okay? She stands up, and she's screaming, okay? We call it screaming bloody murder in the home I grew up in. She is just screaming hysterically. And I look, and it looked like a cougar had taken its paws to her neck, okay? However she crashed, the oak bush just completely destroyed her neck. Like, it was like claws all the way down her neck. And blood is rushing down, and I'm like, whoa, stay calm, Eric. So she's screaming. She's like hyperventilating. She's panicked, you know, and I'm like, okay, I think I can like wipe the blood away. And I look, and one of the branches had splintered off, and it was jammed inside her neck, you guys. Some of you are like, I can't listen anymore. You know, it's PG-13. And I'm like, oh my goodness. And so I start to like pull at it, and like I pull on this side, and something moved on this side, and I was like, okay, I'm not touching this, right? And so what I say to her in the moment, I'm like, Nora, just keep breathing. Babe, take a deep breath, Nora. Dad's here. You got to keep breathing. I get out my phone, I call Carissa, I'm like, babe, you got to get over here. This is bad. She pulls up in the minivan. About 5 minutes later, the trails are kind of by our house, and we go to the urgent care. And urgent care is like, we're not going to touch that for fear it could be in her jugular. We're not going to pull it out. I'm like, what? Her jugular? They're like, you got to go to the emergency room. So we go to the emergency room, and eventually, because of the great care of the doctors, they were able to extract this splinter that was like this long inside of her neck. It wasn't in her jugular, thankfully. They gave her one of those wonderful smoothies. That was her favorite part, smoothies and a lollipop, you know. They sent her home with a bandage. They sent us home with mom and dad with a way to care for Nora's neck. To this day, she still has these scars across her neck from that crash. I bring up this story because this story is going to serve as a metaphor for the entire series. It's how Nora survived a physical emergency, but the steps that we took are the steps we can take to survive a spiritual emergency as well. And what I mean by that is that when it came to helping Nora, there was this moment of panic and disorientation. She was hyperventilating, she was sobbing, and it was like, just keep breathing. And then we had to get the right people around her. We had to surround her with the right people. We had to get mom, we had to get urgent care. They weren't all that helpful. We had to get to the ER. All right? We had to get the right people. Then we had to have the right type of treatment, precise treatment at the right time in the right way. We had to develop a plan for how to heal going forward. We had to bandage the wound. Well, they did, not me. They bandaged the wound. And then mom and dad had things to do for about the next month to care for this wound so that it could heal. And in all of that, those 5 steps, those are the 5 steps we're going to take in this series to learn how to survive a spiritual emergency as well. And today is part 1. And today I want to begin with just this. When it comes to an emergency, you could write this down if you'd like. When it comes to an emergency, the first step in an emergency is to keep breathing. It's to keep breathing. You might think that sounds very simple, and it really is, but when we face an emergency, a physical emergency, and panic sets in, and we're disoriented, and our heart's beating, and our minds are racing, and we're not sure where to turn, we're not sure what to do, sometimes you just have to take a deep breath. You got to slow down. You got to keep breathing, because with enough breath in your lungs, you can fuel good thinking, and you can form a plan. This is how it is in a physical emergency, but listen, this is how it is in a spiritual emergency as well. A spiritual emergency is the moment when you discover that which you thought you believed, that which you loved, is not true anymore, and therefore is a lie, and you can't love a lie anymore. Or at least it's the moment when the foundation you built your world on begins to crack a little bit, begins to quake a little bit, begins to shift just a little bit. And in those spiritual emergencies, it is very helpful for us to keep breathing. Now today, I want to show you this from the Bible. And I want to take you into the story of a man who experienced his own spiritual emergency. He was all in on his religion, you guys. He was all in, and then he came to discover that he wasn't all wrong, but he was wrong in the most significant areas. He was right in some aspects of this, but he was wrong in the biggest of ways. He had missed the main thing. His name's the Apostle Paul. And throughout the New Testament, he would document, or others would document, his spiritual crisis, his spiritual emergency. And that is because it's designed to help us in ours. And so what I want to do today is take us into the Apostle Paul's spiritual emergency to look at how he survived, what God did in his life to help him survive, who he brought into his life to help him survive. And I think we're going to see a few things that are very, very important and will be very comforting for us in our spiritual emergency, or help us comfort others in theirs. So I want to begin in the New Testament letter of Philippians. If you're unfamiliar with the Bible begins with 4 Gospels, then it turns into the book of Acts, which is Luke, the author Luke's sequel to the Gospel of Luke. It's the book of Acts, and we're going to be in there in a little bit, but most of the New Testament is made up of these letters written to churches, Jesus followers, like many of us, trying to discover how to follow Jesus. And so he writes this one letter to the Christians in the city of Philippi, and he begins in chapter 3 to talk in an autobiographical way about his own life. And I want you to see that first. So Philippians 3, picking it up in verse 4. Philippians 3, verse 4, the Apostle Paul says this: I myself have reasons for such confidence. If someone else thinks they have reasons to put confidence in the flesh, I have more. He begins to talk about his way of life before Jesus. I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day, of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, in regard to the law, a Pharisee, as for zeal, persecuting the church, as for righteousness based on the law, I was faultless. Faultless. Just want to pause there and talk about Paul. Guys, he was all in on his religion. He was all in. He had worked his way to the top. I mean, if there was a ladder of spirituality, he was on the top step, the top rung. I mean, he was all in, and people looked up to him and respected him. When he walked up, people opened the door. He got all the accolades. People talked about him. They whispered about him. Do you know who that is? That's Paul, Hebrew of Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin. I mean, he had it going on, you guys. He had all the accolades. He dressed well. He was a smooth talker. Probably drove the nicest Tesla in the lot, you know. Didn't have Teslas back then, but you get it, you know? I mean, he had it going on. People wanted to be like him. He was all in on his faith. He was all in on his religion. They looked up to him. Now, in the book of Acts, we see more about his spiritual heritage, his pedigree, if you will. In Acts chapter 22, Paul's actually giving a speech himself. If Philippians serves as an autobiographical section, the book of Acts gives us a bit of a biography into the life, leadership, and ministry of the Apostle Paul. So in Acts chapter 22, we see another section where Paul describes in a speech his way of life before Jesus. He said this: I'm a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city. I studied under Gamaliel, was thoroughly trained in the law of our ancestors. I was just as zealous for God as any of you are today. I persecuted the followers of this way to their death, arresting both men and women and throwing them into prison, as the high priest and all the council can themselves testify. I even obtained letters from them to their associates in Damascus and went there to bring these people as prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. In other words, the Apostle Paul was as true blue as they come. He came from the right lineage. He studied under Gamaliel, who was the foremost rabbi of the day. He was so incredibly zealous I mean, if there were boxes to check, he checked them all and he added more at the end. One of them being to rid the earth of this group of people that he couldn't stand, Christians. This is who Paul was. He was all in, you guys, on this way of life, this approach to his faith. And then in Acts chapter 9, a bit earlier, something happened in the Apostle Paul's life where what he was all in on, he came to discover he was severely wrong on. Primarily wrong about who Jesus was. And so in Acts chapter 9, here comes the Apostle Paul's spiritual emergency. It all comes crashing down. Happened on the road to Damascus. Let me read this section for us. Acts chapter 9, picking it up in verse 1. Meanwhile, Saul was still breathing out murderous threats against the Lord's disciples. Saul and Paul, it's the same person. He went to the high priest and asked him for letters to the synagogues in Damascus, so that if he found any there who belonged to the way, that's what Jesus' followers were called at the time, they're just part of this new way of life, whether men or women, he might take them as prisoners to Jerusalem. As he neared Damascus on his journey, suddenly a light from heaven flashed around him. He fell to the ground and heard a voice say to him, Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me? Who are you, Lord? Saul asked. I'm Jesus, who you are persecuting. He replied, now get up and go into the city, and you'll be told what you must do. Let me just pause right there. This is a moment where we see the supernatural breaking into the natural world. And for some people, maybe some of us in the room, we're skeptics at heart, cynics at heart. I'm with you. I'm a skeptic at heart. And when we see moments where the supernatural, meaning that which is beyond nature, breaks into the natural world, like a moment like this, or the moment we celebrated last week, the resurrection, sometimes we have to do some good thinking to discover if that's possible or plausible. I just want you to know this. If creation happened, then we already know that something beyond nature created nature. And if something beyond nature can create nature, then of course the thing that's beyond nature can break into the natural world too. I don't know if you've studied cosmology before. Not cosmetology, cosmology. Cosmology is the study of the cosmos, or the universe, okay? The brightest and best cosmologists say that the universe had a beginning. And if the universe had a beginning, whatever caused it has to be beyond what was created. So if time, matter, space, and energy were created, then that which created those things, this universe, must be timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and all-powerful. And to shorten that up, because it would take a long time to say that timeless, spaceless, immaterial, all-powerful being, every time we wanted to talk about God, we just say God, okay? We just say God. And if God could cause all that we see, then something beyond nature, him, has broken into nature, and a moment like this, or the resurrection, is of course possible. And in fact, we should expect it, that God would be working in our world. So that's what's happening. Look at what Jesus says, though, to Saul. Now get up and go into the city, and you will be told what you must do. The men traveling with Saul, well, they stood there speechless. They heard the sound, but they did not see anyone. So Saul got up from the ground, but when he opened his eyes, he could see nothing. So they led him by the hand into Damascus. For 3 days he was blind and did not eat or drink anything. He was blind, he did not eat, he did not drink. All right? Kind of like Nora, after her emergency, she didn't want to eat and she didn't want to drink, okay? I just want to pause there for just a moment. A couple months back, my wife and I were binging this show on Hulu. And it was an interesting show. In the show, there was this central character. He was a detective who was devout in his religion. And over the course of the show, he was trying to solve this case. It was a riveting show. It was tense. But throughout the show, this detective's faith was unraveling at the seams. He was all in on his faith. He was all in on his religion, his spirituality. But over the course of the show, he began to pick up on pieces of information that let him know that which he thought he believed wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. The foundation was beginning to crack. And there was this one scene that I watched, and tears started to flow down my face because I thought of so many people who have been through their own spiritual emergencies, so many of us who call SMCC home. This is an incredibly safe place for people who have gone through or are going through spiritual emergency, because you can belong before you believe. So in this show, one night, it was in the middle of the night, his wife was in bed, his kids were in bed, he went out to the car and he had this pretty thick book that began to walk through the things about his faith that he thought he believed. He began to show him through this book that he was reading the evidence, the history, the facts. And as he sat there in his car, in his garage, he began to weep uncontrollably. He began to sob. He couldn't breathe. He was having a panic attack because he started to wrestle with, what does this now mean for my world? What does this mean for my work, for my family, for my in-laws, for the holidays? All that I used to believe, I can't believe anymore. It was such a powerful scene. When we think about the Apostle Paul, if you've been a Christian for a while, if you've read this story before, you're like, oh yeah, he just became a Jesus follower. So cool, Awesome, Do you know how hard this must have been for him? What type of emergency this must have been for him? He was all in, you guys. He was at the top. And he goes through this moment where the one that he was trying to rid the earth of, Jesus and his followers, was the one that he was now going to pledge his loyalty and allegiance to. I would imagine there were a few nights where he sobbed uncontrollably as all of this was happening. I can just imagine the Apostle Paul thinking through the passages from the Old Testament where he goes, oh my gosh, that was about Jesus. Oh my gosh, that was pointing to the cross. Oh my gosh, this was God's plan all along. I imagine him having to unlearn all the things that he was once taught that just weren't true. And I imagine there were some moments where he just had to take some deep breaths, where he just had to keep breathing. And you can almost see how Paul being blinded by God was a gift of grace from God, because there was not much else he could do but sit and wait. Sit and be patient. He had to be still. He had to breathe. So here's what happens next. I love this next part. Picking it up in verse 10 now of Acts chapter 9. In Damascus, there was a disciple named Ananias. The Lord called to him in a vision, Ananias. Yes, Lord, he answered. The Lord told him, go to the house of Judas on Straight Street. Ask for a man from Tarsus named Saul, for he's praying. In a vision, he has seen a man named Ananias come and place his hands on him to restore his sight. Lord, Ananias answered, I've heard many reports about this man and all the harm he's done to your holy people in Jerusalem. He's come here with authority from the chief priests to arrest all, meaning me, who call on your name. God, do you have this right? You got the wrong guy, Lord. Send somebody else. I mean, this is not set up as like fiction. Like, oh, what an interesting story. Then Ananias, full of faith, said, Paul, he's my guy, I'm going to come be there for him. It's like, God, I've heard about this guy. There are people who are no longer living that I used to know because of him, and now you want me to go there? Is that a death sentence, Lord? It's not. But the Lord said to Ananias, go. This man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. I will show him how much he must suffer for my name. Then Ananias went to the house and entered it. Placing his hands on Saul, he said, Brother Saul, the Lord, Jesus, who appeared to you on the road as you were coming here, he has sent me so that you may see again and be filled with the Holy Spirit. Immediately, something like scales fell from Saul's eyes. I think these physical scales, whatever was going on with his vision, they were symbolic of the fact that when Jesus entered into his life, he would be able to see clearly. So the scales fall from his eyes. He got up, was baptized. Look at this next part. After taking some food, he regained his strength. What an interesting detail. Perhaps implying he wasn't eating, wasn't taking care of himself maybe. In those moments where he couldn't see, he had stopped taking care of the basics. Stop taking care of the basics. What I love about this is God brings Saul into community, Paul into community, because up until this point, all the community he knew was now the community he was going to walk away from. And so God brought someone around him to help him with just the basics, to regain his sight, to eat, to drink, just to keep breathing. Now, I just want to pause there and talk about why I think this is so helpful. When you are in a spiritual emergency, it is easy to jump to the next thing incredibly quickly. It's easy to turn to something else because there's this big gap, there's this void in your life. Like this was my life, this was my Sunday, this was my evenings, this is what I was all in on, and now that it's gone, now I'm going to turn to something else so incredibly quickly. And I've seen this happen quite often. When people go through a spiritual emergency, they're panicked, their decision-making is stunted, their thinking isn't clear, they find themselves isolated, and they begin to make quick, rash decisions that can actually be harmful. They turn to coping mechanisms that they didn't have before, but now they think they're going to go to that because that'll be helpful, but it's not. It actually does more harm, right? Or they turn to a person and go, look, that's my new person now. I'm going to listen to everything they say. And that might not be helpful because unfortunately there are people who prey on the vulnerable in the midst of spiritual emergencies. Sometimes those people just spin into this type of depression. They spiral out because they don't know what life's about. And it's in those moments that we just need to move slowly. And I think this is part of God's kindness to Paul, that blindness helped him move slowly through some of this. I'd love for you to see this point. I'll put it up on the screen. The point I want to make is this. Well, we don't know how to not be committed. We don't know how to not be committed. And that might sound like an interesting point, so let me break this down. When you are all in on something, totally committed to something, and you realize you can't commit to that thing anymore, it's very common just to commit to the next thing after. And I've seen this many times with people in Utah, my dear friends. They were so committed to one thing, and that thing goes away, so they commit to the other thing incredibly quickly without really testing the waters, without asking tough questions, without getting wisdom from really wise people. So they jump all in on, CrossFit or something. I got nothing against CrossFit, but it's like, that's my new church now, CrossFit, Or they jump all in on, crystals or witchcraft or New Age or just some other belief system. Not because they investigated it and discovered that it was true, but simply because they need to commit to something again. And so we do. We feel like we need to commit, but the problem is that when we commit too quickly, we find ourselves all in on something that we haven't investigated in the first place, which only sets us up for more difficulty. So that's one extreme. I'm going to commit to something in the next few days after I've left another thing that I spent years in. But on the other side, there's a group of people who say this, you know what? I will never commit to anything again. I've been duped before. I've been tricked before. I've been abused before. Trust is now blown. I don't think I can trust anybody ever again, so I will never commit to anything ever again. Let me just say, I understand that approach. If you've been hurt, of course, it's a great coping mechanism to say, I'll never commit to something again, so I'm not hurt again, which just means you are committed to non-committal. All right? You're committed to never committing again. Which, look, that will prevent you from being burned by a lie, but it will prevent you from ever embracing truth. It will prevent you from being duped by a lie if you never commit to anything ever again. And I can understand why that sounds like a desirous way to live. But it'll also keep you from the type of truth that can set you free. So as we build on this and talk about this a little bit more, you could write this next point down. We desire truth, but we're afraid of committing to a lie. We desire truth, but we're afraid of committing to a lie, and that's where we get stuck in the middle. That's where we get stuck. And you have to be with us through this series because we're going to talk about how you can pursue truth again, how you can carefully ask good questions, you can carefully investigate evidence, and you can begin to build a worldview where you don't just survive your emergency, you thrive on the other side of it and become a safe person to help other people thrive in their spiritual emergency as well. So in the immediate aftermath of a spiritual emergency, here's my recommendation. Just take a deep breath. Take a deep breath. Don't be hasty. Be patient. Don't be rash. Don't fall prey to panic-based decision making. My encouragement is to belong with people who can love you, to belong with people who won't force you to believe something in the next moment. Be with people, a culture where you can belong before you believe. And I think this is why SMCC has been known as one of the safest places. We have a reputation, you guys, of being a safe place for people in spiritual emergency because we give people room to breathe. Give people room to breathe. When I fly, there's this moment when I'm on the airplane, it happens with you too, where the stewardess or the flight attendant comes up and shows you how to work the air mask. Have you had this moment before? I bet you have. I think they have to do this all the time. And whenever they do that, I never listen because my plan is if the plane goes down, Jesus, here I come. So, I'm not really putting the air mask on. I probably should. But what I've been told is this, that when you put it on, you're supposed to put it on because you need to keep breathing first. And they always say this, put this on you before you put it on anybody next to you. You know, your children, you know, your pet, whoever's next to you, you know, put it on you first. And I've been told by people who have done this that sometimes it doesn't even look like the air is flowing. It doesn't even look like the bag is pumping, but it is still working. Because in the moment, taking breath is important to surviving a spiritual emergency. So I want to give you 5 ways to do this. 5 really simple ways that we can begin to do this now. If you're in a spiritual crisis now, these 5 things are going to be helpful for you. If you know somebody that's in a spiritual crisis, these 5 things are something you can offer them that will be incredibly helpful. Or perhaps your spiritual emergency is in the future, and maybe you just don't know it yet. I've been through some crisis in my own life that I didn't see coming, that hit me when I was a pastor, you know. And these 5 things can be important. Let me take you through them one by one. How to keep breathing in a spiritual emergency. Number 1, eat well. Eat well. It's an interesting detail that Luke would include in the book of Acts, that Paul took food, right? Some of you are like, that's my favorite verse. I love food, you know. He needed to eat. He needed to eat. You know, eat well. Take a trip to the ice cream place, you know, get yourself a crumble cookie, but like, you know, have a good balanced diet. It's important. It's important because you fuel good thinking. And when you fuel good thinking, you can process your emergency. Here's the second, exercise. Just keep moving, you know? I'm not saying you have to go to CrossFit, but like, you know, keep moving. I've discovered something. I've been preaching now for, 16, 17, 18 years. And I've noticed that when I exercise, the thoughts that I have get metabolized into my heart, mind, and soul quickly. There's been times I sit at my desk and I try to like memorize a section of a message or even write, and my brain feels foggy. But then when I exercise, somehow the message gets internalized, metabolized into my life all the more. And the science has been done. God has wired us in this way, that your brain is designed to function at its peak level when your body's healthy. And so when your body's healthy, you can process some of the most painful things you've gone through, including a spiritual emergency. Here's the third thing, rest. Rest. This means more than sleep, right? More than sleep, but it doesn't mean less than it. You need to get a good night's rest. Avoid making rash decisions, no major changes. But here's the 5th one. This is where I want to spend most of my time as we wrap up. You need to be able to grieve. In an emergency, especially a spiritual emergency, grieving is very, very difficult. Here in the West, in our culture, we don't grieve well as people. We don't grieve well, but grief is sort of the emotion that gives room for every other emotion. Because when you have unprocessed trauma, pain, or wounds, that stunts your ability to feel other things. You need to grieve. You need to get that out of the way to give room for new emotions. And in my own life, I don't grieve well. I recently, over the last 2 years, I've needed to grieve a few things. In fact, I took our staff last year, asked Tom about this, through a grief inventory. What are the losses you faced in your life that you need to grieve? Grieving is saying goodbye to something that you valued immensely. Saying goodbye. And in a spiritual emergency, grief is this. It is saying goodbye to the spiritual settings, the people, the community, or the culture that you were once a part of. And there are some things you can hang on to that were good from that situation, perhaps, maybe good from that season, perhaps. But you need to be able to grieve. You need to say goodbye to something that you valued. You need to name what it was, maybe even journal what it was, say goodbye to it, and release that thing. I imagine the Apostle Paul, he had to do some grieving. In fact, we know he did some grieving. See, here's the thing about a spiritual emergency. You can get through it. You can move through it. You can come out the other side. And the Apostle Paul did the very thing. So where we started in the Bible, Philippians 3, I want us to end there. If we go back to Philippians 3 and we read just a little bit more, verses 7 through 9, we see this. Paul says, whatever were gains to me, sort of gains from my religion, I now consider loss. They went away. I had to grieve them. They didn't mean what I thought they meant. I had to say goodbye to them. Loss for the sake of Christ. What is more, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord, for whose sake I have lost all things. On the other side of his spiritual emergency, Jesus was there. For a moment, he lost his grip on reality. He lost his grip on his faith. He lost his grip on his worldview. But over time, in Jesus, it was all rebuilt. And the Apostle Paul would go on to pen so much of the New Testament. Go on to give his life for Jesus. He found joy in Christ. He counted his previous life as loss. The passage Jesse read earlier, he's been crucified with Christ, but now the life he lives by faith in the Son of God. The next part is this, who loved us and gave himself for us. And so the Apostle Paul came to know Jesus on the other side of his spiritual emergency. We're going to get there over the next 5 weeks and show you what that means. But Paul got there on the other side of his emergency, which means there's hope for us in our emergencies as well. There's purpose again, if you want it. There's meaning again, if you want it. There's a relationship with God again, if you want it. There's a healthy church community to call home again, if you want it. So the bottom line of today's message is this. It's our gospel truth. Jesus committed to death so that you could commit to life. Jesus committed to death. On the cross, we looked at it on Good Friday, he took his last breath so that we could continue to breathe and find life in him. The Apostle Paul lived this. Many in this room have lived this. If you're in the midst of a spiritual emergency now, there's hope. So the first step, not the only step, we have 4 more to go, but the first step is to just keep breathing, and perhaps if you're able, do some grieving. And then you will be on your way to being able to rebuild your worldview and survive and thrive on the other side of your spiritual emergency. So here's what I want to do. The band's back on stage. We're going to sing a song, but I want to invite you to stand first. I'm going to pray for us. Go ahead and stand to your feet. But I want to try something a little bit unique today. I want to pray for a certain group of people in the room. I love to pray for everybody, but today I want to pray for a certain group of people. If you have gone through a spiritual emergency in your life, I'm just wondering if you'd be bold enough and just let me know. If you would just raise your hand if you've been through a spiritual emergency before. Yeah, a lot of us. And I'm curious, if you're in a spiritual emergency now, would you be bold enough to raise your hand? Just curious. I want to pray for those 2 groups of people. Let's pray together. Jesus, the world is messy and broken. We're messy and broken. Because of that mess, you call it sin. It's robbing our lives of joy. It shows up inside the walls of churches. It shows up in our faith. Like this place is not immune from that. So we need your help. God, so many people in this room have experienced their own spiritual emergencies. They're some of the most courageous people I've ever met because they've done such a difficult thing, which was to look at the evidence, face, perhaps walk away from something that brought pain then into their life. Would you strengthen them? Would you comfort them, God? Would you encourage them? Would you bring people around them throughout this series, around them at this campus, to support them as they continue to pursue truth? And Jesus, because you are the way, the truth, and the life, that would be a journey that leads them to you as the destination. And for those of us who are in the middle of a spiritual emergency now, I just pray these moments that we've had together would just be a safe place to breathe. I pray that people would sense through us that they can belong before they believe. Jesus, I pray that this series for us is a journey that brings strength and support, clear thinking, healthy emotion, great relationships into the lives of people who are struggling now. Jesus, you came for the sick, broken, the lost, the confused, the sinners. Church isn't like a museum for people who are perfect. It's a hospital for those who are broken, injured, going through emergencies. So here we are. I'm going to take these next few minutes and sing to you, and I pray your comforting love will comfort those in the midst of their emergency. It's in your name, Jesus, we pray.